going to talk, my interest in the last 2 years, I came back with incredible trepidation just over 2 years ago, believing I would be harassed, because I was harassed. Somewhat. Only for 16 years, though. And not quite to the extent of any bomb threats or anything like that. But my concern was absolutely, utterly, and people are coming and saying, what's happening to Scientology now? And I'm going, I don't know. Ask Tony. Go read the bunker. Because I'm not really interested anymore in the history of Scientology. I'm not really interested in L. Ron Hubbard, though it may not have seemed that way these last few days. I've tried to pick up on the various books that have been written, but there are so many now, isn't that fantastic? But I read Counterfeit Dreams, and that was good, and corresponded a little with Jeff, who I think is incredible. Jeff's, as with Chris Shelton, people who've left and managed to kind of decompress relatively rapidly. There are many people who won't read what I've written. Jesse Prince said that it took him years before we could read my book. And it's a book. What's it going to do to you? You've done all the OT levels. What harm can it? The idea that something, I was working with the Christian churches in East Grinstead, all of them. They called it Churches Together in East Grinstead. Though, of course, the Catholic and the Baptist wouldn't sit in the same room. I suggested they call it Churches Untogether, but nobody listens to me. But one of the Baptists decided that he'd got to come and do an exorcism on my house because of all of the Ron Hubbard stuff. And I thought, well, why not? And it was great because my first wife actually was, oh, listen, I'm like, yeah, okay. And he went upstairs to where my office was, and he started sweating because he saw all of these Aleister Crowley books. And he said, you've got to get rid of those. So why? Well, they're demon-possessed. And I guess it's something like that. I mean, can you actually get that stupid? That you think that an object, well, yeah, you can. I mean, all sorts of religions have got, the fingernail of Jesus or what have you. So, yeah, people objectify, think that, they believe this kind of animist power that comes off things. What bothered me was that I was very definitely seeing that there were people who had left Scientology decades before, and they were still, there was a guy here yesterday, the big guy in the wheelchair, and he was saying, well, I've read John Atack's stuff, but I don't agree with him. And so I don't care whether anybody agrees with me. In fact, I'd rather you didn't. It's hard enough for me believing what I believe without having to share it with anybody. Quite the opposite. When I started publishing on the bunker, and it was like, people aren't recovering. What is this? If I can sit down in a room with somebody for a day, no more chatter. If I can sit down in the room, you're going to ethics, I'm telling you. If I can sit down in a room with somebody for a day, a single day, they will no longer believe in Ron Hubbard. They will no longer believe in Scientology. There's been no exception to this rule in the last 20 years. That's because, to me, it's pretty straightforward. The kind of crooked, twisted route that people have to take to believe this stuff, it's pretty straightforward. It's like, it doesn't work. Now, this guy, yesterday, we did talk, and he said, I cannot fault anything you said, but I disagree with you. The tech is fantastic. The tech works. It's like walking into a children's book. It's like going to Disneyland and going, hey, this is all real. There's this great big rat with big ears, and there's this dog and all this, and you're going, no, they're people dressed up in costumes. And for me, Scientology now is that far away. So how do you recover from Scientology? Well, carefully. The first, people talk about, I used to talk about this in '84 when I was first doing it. There's the bridge out, if you want, or the layers of the onion. You can take your own thing. And the first thing will be, hey, the organization is extraordinarily corrupt and unpleasant. I've actually seen a dead agent pack where they quote me as saying that I left Scientology because it was tough and ruthless. And I did say that, and it's a quote from David Miscavige. We're tough and ruthless. I don't want to belong to a tough and ruthless group. The tough bit I could put up with. Ruthless? Without mercy? Why would I want to belong to that? If I wanted to do that, I'd join the Marines. Maybe that could be my next religion in my next lifetime. But it's about critical thinking. It's about only that. And when I went on the bunker and started writing, what was so appealing to me was that people disagreed with me. Not the ones that yelled at me and trolled me. That wasn't appealing at all. But the ones that say, oh, John, no, I don't agree with that. And I could have a discourse with them. It was also the people who read what I'd said and said, how about this? So somebody wrote in, I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, because there were so many people saying so many remarkable things. Somebody said, when I did TR0, I started to feel it was turning me into a narcissist. I went, what a good, oh dear. Because of course the fundamental process of a destructive cult group is to take the members and to clone them. I always cite Flavel Yeakley, who was a guy who was hired by the Boston Church of Christ, by Kip McKean, because somebody had called the Boston Church of Christ a cult group, and Kip McKean was affronted by this, so he hired this top personality expert to do a survey of 900 members of his group. And Flavel Yeakley was a bit freaked out because he said, they've all got the same personality. So he went to Scientology, The Way, various other groups, and did smaller samples. And what he found was that each cult had its own specific personality. He did the test. He said, how were you 5 years ago? How are you now? How do you want to be in 5 years? And they projected forward a different personality type for each group. But within the group, it was the same one. And as its control group, he's a Christian, and so he took Christian congregations, and he found that Christian congregations contain all 16 personality types. And it was a defining moment in the late 1970s to say, something's happening here. And I would say that what happens is that you have, as a normal human being, if there is any such thing, you have many identities. The way that you behave towards your mom, the way that you behave towards your dog, the way that you behave towards an employee, towards your boss, towards a child, towards a shop assistant, these are different and you just slip into them. If you then that's running one way. If you then say the mood you're in runs, we go vertical and horizontal, that if you're angry with your mom, you'll be angry with your mom in a particular way. If you're angry with somebody else, there are limits. There are things we do naturally. There are things that we don't even think about. And for me, my teacher in this was one of the greatest SPs of all time, Louis Jolyon West, who was the head of neuropsychiatry and biobehavior. Imagine that, neuropsychiatry, at UCLA School of Medicine. And we became good friends. There was probably some rose perfume in the room, and I didn't know what was happening, And he developed he wrote a paper in the 80s, a little bit before Steve Hassan, independently, in fact, came to the same sort of idea. We have all of these identities. It's not a multiple personality deal. They're not separate. It's a continuum. We move between them quite naturally. We don't even notice we're doing it. And then that's your personality. That's your self, your ego. It's formed of these things. And then along comes a cult group, and it grafts on this parasitic identity. There'll be one mood that you're meant to have. Enthusiasm, tone 4. And that's unless you're in tone 40, which means shouting at people. Never did get that. Serenity of beingness. Not really. And there'll be the way you behave to your superiors and the way you behave to your inferiors, and possibly the way you behave to your equals, but that's it, 3 identities. That's your lot. And of course, where your family, and before you had a different relationship with your brother and your cousin and your mom and your dad and your kids and what have you, they are now inferiors if they're not in the cult. So you behave to them generally in a, slightly churlish way. So in coming away from a cult group, it's significant that you have to become human again. You have to go back to who you were, and you see that when somebody leaves a cult group, they're typically 11 or 12 years old. They're in that stage of maturity where you've got the hero worship. I have 4 children. I My daughter never did it, but my 3 sons all went through this. Oh, you're perfect, Dad. And it's like, oh, God, no. I'll keep them deceived for a little while longer, because they're doing the washing up or what have you. But then comes adolescence and the rejection, which is a good evolutionary stage, though unpleasant to bear on the parental end, where they rebel and they start to form a separate, distinct self, and they start to realize you're full of shit, as Robin Williams once put it. And so people come out of a cult and they grow a beard, well, the men do, mainly the men, and they smoke dope, and they do the kind of rebellious things that they were not allowed to do in the cult. And I've seen this too many times. There was a multimillionaire I was staying with once in California, whose name has been mentioned while we were here, and you can guess who it was, because I'm not going to tell you, not ever, not even if you torture him. Well, if you offer me money, maybe. And I visited this guy, and he said, my 15-year-old, I found a lid of weed in his room, and so I took it from him, and I told him off, and I put it in a drawer. And I thought, I should throw that away, really. And a week went by, and I thought, well, it's a long time since I smoked dope. Now, he's telling me this story while he's rolling a spliff, and the people I'm with are ex-Scientologists, and they're, about 80% of my friends are all, these are people in their 40s and 50s, and they're all kind of being like teen. Not that there's anything wrong with weed, that's fine, okay? This is not a polemic against marijuana. Not at all. I think it's probably a very helpful drug. I don't agree with smoking anything. I don't think it's a good idea, but certainly more helpful than alcohol in my experience of people, because you don't get to hit anybody when you've smoked weed. But nonetheless, it's an adolescent behavior. Its maturity has to happen, so you have to come away. The second part of this, and I really could speak for hours, as I'm sure you've all realized by now, so I am only going to get to a couple of bits of this. I have a book coming out later this year, which I expect to sell 7 or 8 copies of, which is specifically about recovering from Scientology. So it will be incomprehensible babble to anybody else, as Scientology, of course, is to anybody in their right mind. But the point of Scientology is to get you out of your mind anyway. And I'm just going to go to one other place that I think is incredibly relevant, and I think is the missing piece. I was in Los Angeles in 1990, I think it was, and Steve Hassan and I were there, and we went to a group of ex-members. There were about 25 people there, and these people, most of them had been out for years, and they wanted to start a newsletter. And they said, oh, you ran a newsletter, Reconnection, and Steve ran his ex-Moon, so they wanted our advice. And I said, look, there are 2 things. The first one is, don't be snide. Don't be, that childish sort of trolling that we see so much of on the internet these days. Don't be nasty, don't be horrid, don't be aggressive. Understand that these people, you're writing to people who've been hurt, and you should be gentle with them, and factual and this kind of thing. And the other thing is, don't use Scientologese. Write it in English, because that way, people outside of, who've not been through this experience will be able to understand it. They created a newsletter called The Informer. Now, I did suggest that, in my country, an informer is what we call a grass or a snitch. It's not a term that we use for a newspaper. But they called it The Informer, and you opened it up, and it was just this derogatory polemic in Scientology. They really didn't get it. What I got was that these people had been meeting for 5 years by this time, and they were all, well, they weren't all, that's not true. A couple of them were on the right track as far as I could tell. But most of them, 20 or so of these people, they were really angry. They'd had 5 years to work this out as they call themselves a focus group. I'm not sure what they were focusing, well, I think I am sure what they were focusing on. They were focusing on the damage that had been done to them and how much they hated Scientology. And it made me think. So I put together this little thing. I got 12 people in a room. Between us, we had over 200 years of experience in Scientology. There was at least one OSA plant. When ever 2 people are gathered together in my name, at least one of them will be an OSA plant. And I said, let's go around the room. Everybody gets to talk, and I want to start with the 8 dynamics. And who is there in this room who has used the 8 dynamics to solve a problem? I'm not I'm not deriding anything or decrying anything. Everybody gets to express themselves, and I expected to hear some interesting stories. Go to the first guy. Never used the 8 dynamics to solve a problem. Oh, okay. Go to the next guy. Never used the 8 dynamics to solve a problem. We went around the whole room. Over 200 years' experience of Scientology. This is a basic, fundamental truth of Scientology. If you have a problem, you estimate it against the 8 dynamics. How's it good for me? How's it good for my wife and kids? How's it good for, the baseball club I play in? How's it good for mankind? How's it good for matter, energy, space, and time? And on through the 8 dynamics. And then I got to do my clever bit and realised that I was the man that shouldn't be in the room. Because everybody's going to sit there and go, what does John think? Because John knows so much about Scientology, and he's never stops talking. And I was sitting there going, nobody's ever used this. What do you make of that? Now, the idea is that if I have a problem, I assess it across these dynamics, and each one gets a vote. And it struck me, after 9 years' involvement in Scientology and a couple of years out of it, that this was, what's the word for it, the technical word for it? Nuts will do. Stupid, vacuous, insane. So here we are. It's like, shall I blow up America? Well, it's good for me. It's good for my family. Gets rid of all those bloody Americans. It's good for my baseball club, because we always lose when we play the American teams. Mankind, well, sod mankind. It's good for my pet rock. My pet rock's always hated Americans. It's good for God, I think, so we blow America up. And you're going, there is one vote for me, one vote for 7 billion people. There's a certain inequality involved in this. And what's more, if you believed in God, even if you got the other 7 votes, how could you possibly do something that went against the will of God? This is vacuous nonsense. I then did the same thing with the RC triangle. Hubbard says, if you increase communication, you will increase affinity. He also says, bullets too are communication. So if I shoot somebody, they'll like me more. How did I believe this drivel for 9 years? This is a fundamental notion of Scientology. Forget the black magic, forget the sociopathic narcissist. It's nonsense. And for me, this is the final piece of recovery. You sit down with other people and you talk about the tenets, the beliefs, and you see if they make sense. And they don't. You suddenly move in and you're looking at reality rather than what you would like to believe. If we could perhaps now bring Christian Sturko and Nan McLean and Hana Whitfield up onto the stage. Thank you. Just sit here by me. And we're going to talk about recovery. We have where do I want you? Where I can get you. That would be fine, and unless, you're lefty or righty, there are biases. Why don't we start with Hana Whitfield, who knows quite a lot about the distress that Scientology can cause, both in her own life and that of others, and also a great deal about how you recover. She's also one of the sweetest and most pleasant people I've ever met.
Thank you, John. And thank you for being here to hear this today. Of course, I had my own recovery to go through, which was very long and very stressful, and compounded with the fact that I grew up in an abusive family cult, which really set me up for Scientology. So I had a double whammy. So when I came out, I had to...
Just hold it by there. Yes.
Right there? Oh, great. So when I came out, I had the double whammy to tear apart, to take the layers off of bit by bit. My husband and I also started very quickly to work with families who had a loved one in Scientology to help them get them out. So we worked with the recovery of those individuals. And so I was very privileged to have to be working with others, because seeing what they were going through and having my own things still to go through was very helpful to me. Seeing what they had to, the computations they had to take apart, the fears they had to get over, the ingrained beliefs and commands and ideas from Hubbard that in some cases had been there for 50 or 20 years, and how that individual, because every one of them was different, every one of their recoveries was different. They went through different experiences in Scientology. They had different reactions to a similar experience in Scientology, and of course, they grew up in different families, went to different schools. Some were bullied, some weren't. And this is all becomes a huge mix. In order to help me take it apart somewhat, I want to very quickly go to an experience on the ship that was one of the worst, I think. I don't even know you know about this one, John. In 1968, it wasn't the Apollo yet, on the Royal Scotsman, Hubbard was sailing from Marseille down to Spanish Morocco in northern Africa. And I was on the Avon River in Valencia. He got down to Spanish Morocco and they took on board about 120 brand new, untrained recruits. Now you'd think that a man of Hubbard's ability, his OT-ness, and all his superlative staff would be able to easily assimilate 100 totally raw recruits who hadn't even done their basic Sea Org training. One night in Valencia, my chief officer Amos came running up to me, Amos Jessup, and he said, "Hubbard's on the radio from Spanish Malia and he wants to talk to you now, Hana, and he's crying." And I said, "Oh my God," I raced down to the radio room, picked up and said, "Hello, sir." And he was bawling, absolutely bawling. And I was sort of thunderstruck with this. And I didn't say anything. It all just came pouring out of him. He said, "By God, the fuckers have done it to me again. And here we are in the Spanish port and they sent all these new recruits. Not one of them thought about getting them trained. They're running all over the ship unchecked. Nobody's getting it in control. And I'm desperate and I want you to come immediately with the Avon River because you have to take command. I've already fired the captain of the ship and you have to take command of the Royal Scotsman." I absolutely froze. Can you imagine? I think that's the one time my logical mind came roaring back in full force just for that brief moment. And I said, I'd be absolutely nuts to set sail right now and run into the biggest fiasco of my life. So on purpose, we spent about 2 days, going ashore slowly and picking up the machine parts that were getting repaired and taking on food and taking on water because I didn't want to get there quickly. I couldn't bear the thought of becoming the sole person to take over this fiasco. Well, by the time we got to Spanish Malia, the Royal Scotsman had sailed on to Tangiers, to La Goulette, the port of La Goulette in Tunisia. And so then we took our time traveling on, and by the time we got there, Hubbard had gotten it under control, and you will not believe how. I heard from my husband at that time that he had assigned any staff member who erred in any way in getting discipline put in on board. He had assigned them to old water tanks, not full of water, old ones, empty ones, that the crew were chipping out. They get rusty inside and they get stained and so on. So periodically the deckies would go down there and start chipping out a little. Well, Hubbard had decided this would be an absolute opportune time to get every single crew member who had erred in some way to go down into the tanks, and some were kept there for 12 hours, some for 24, some for 48, and some for 76 hours. There were no toilet breaks. Their food was given to them in little buckets, and they were not allowed to sleep. Baron Berez was the master at arms, an absolutely tyrannical little monster, and he had this little baton that he would carry on his belt. And he had his little underlings that he trained to do the same thing. And he would patrol during the day, not at night. Baron was one to get his beauty sleep. But during the day, he'd patrol around and look into the tanks because the hatches were open on top. And any person, any Sea Org member who was dozing off, he would rap with his baton on the metal tank, which would reverberate like crazy inside. Can you imagine the noise inside to wake up these Sea Org members? And my former husband was assigned to one of the tanks for 72 hours, and he said he almost came out like a total zombie. That's a story that we should pass down to those who think that Miscavige is the only one who is brutal. This came from Hubbard himself. Miscavige learned from the best.
Yeah, it's maybe an opportune moment to pass to Nan.
Nan, go ahead. I haven't spoken about...
Or is
But go
her
ahead, go ahead.
lav mic working?
My mic might be enough.
Yeah, do you want
Is
to
it?
pass that one back to Hannah, and you go ahead and tell us some of your story.
Well,
if
to
anybody
begin-
doesn't know, Nan McLean actually started fighting Scientology before I got into it. I got into it 40 years ago. So this is some remarkable lady.
No, I'm not. But
No,
I
she's
really,
not. Okay, sorry, scratch that.
I really want to thank both you, John, and Jim. I don't see him here, but I guess.
Skiving.
Pardon?
He's skiving.
Well, anyway, I want to thank you for having this conference. It's the most healing. And before I begin, I'd like to tell you that I had a healing experience when this lady came up to me as we departed from our morning session, and she told me who she was, and she told me that she had been in Toronto during the time that we did all our fighting with Scientology, etc., and she was in the GO. And she apologized. Okay, I'm all right. But I want you to know I'm really scared, and I have a right to be because I'm 92. So, with that, I joined in 1969. And I brought my son, who is there, my other son, his wife, and their 2 children into Scientology. My daughter refused. She had a mind of her own that was as strong as a horse. And so we joined. Now, I'm going to have to refer to my notes because that's the way I am. So, where do I begin?
The beginning.
Well, I did fall in love with the technique, the tech. And I wanted more. And I read the grade chart in the 1970 grade chart, which stated the ability to be at cause, both subjectively and objectively, over matter, energy, space, and time. And that was written by Hubbard. And it was on the grade chart, as I said.
It was withdrawn in 1974. I still have printed version.
Well, that's partly because I spoke out about it.
Okay, there you go.
Because if you had those abilities, and this is what I said, you'd be God. Are there any OTs here today, OT8s here today? No, that's too bad, because I was going to ask them directly, do you feel you're God? Anyway, I became an ordained minister in the first and probably only ministerial ceremony in Canada. But we didn't have religious status at that time. And it was still, no, wait a minute, the church didn't have religious status in Canada in those days. However, it was, and still is, in my opinion, a civilization unto itself. We had our own laws, as written by L. Ron Hubbard, universally practiced throughout the Scientology world, and for a Scientologist, there is no other world, in my opinion. And LRH's relationship to orgs tends to support this. Somebody someday will say this is illegal. By then, be sure the orgs say what is legal or not. So I joined staff. And my first duty was to be a file clerk. You start at the low levels of everything in Scientology. And I came across a policy which said that a person who could be tricked, sued, or lied to, or destroyed, and you've heard that many times. And this is a cute story. I was very disturbed and sought our AG Canada, that being Brian Levman at the time, who patted me on the head, and Brian was 23 and I was 47 at that time, and said, "Don't worry about that, Nan, it's been canceled." I then asked for the cancellation policy, and he gave it to me, and it reads, "The practice of declaring people fair game will cease. Fair game may not appear on any ethics order. It causes bad public relations. This policy letter does not cancel the treatment and handling of an SP." I then said to Brian, "That doesn't cancel the fair game policy." He again patted me on the head and said, "Don't you worry about that, Nan. It's of no concern of yours." Unfortunately, I accepted Mr. Levman's explanation because I needed it to be true in order to continue in Scientology. In my opinion, this is the first step taken by me or any other Scientologist in self-brainwashing. We, the Scientologists, want the technology so badly that we apply any excuse to cover up the blatant, obvious deceptions Hubbard is feeding us. John went to Flag. In 1971. 2 months later, Bruce and Dawn joined with their 2 little children. And several months later, my husband came into Scientology as a paying Scientologist. And he was treated as a celebrity because he was CEO of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation of District 11. While I was a staff member in good standing, I was ordered by the ED, Emile Gilbert, the dissemination secretary, Stuart Smith, and the flag banking officer, Pierre Robillard, to go to 2 different banks as a loan guarantor for 2 different Scientologists, and I refused and was threatened with expulsion. That meant my immortality. When I finally agreed, I was ordered to falsify my income and to list Emile Gilbert as my direct employer, which he was not, And in both instances, I was accepted as the guarantor and of the two applicants, and they received their loans. The money in both cases went directly to Scientology. I had so brainwashed myself that I, a woman who never told a lie, had actually committed an act of perjury. I'm going to skip all this. Go back to Hana for a minute.
Hana?
All right, Nan, thank you for that. I don't know where to hold this again. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's
great. I mentioned the water tank incident on the Royal Scotsman simply as an example to show what some people go through before they leave, and others who sometimes have just walked down the gangway, somehow gotten their passport from the office where they were kept locked up in file cabinets, or not, just walked down the gangway in some foreign port and gone to the nearest embassy or consulate and said, please help me. I'm from that crazy ship over there. I'm scared they're going to find me here. I don't want to go back. I want to go back home. So there are different ways of leaving. There always have been different ways of leaving Scientology and the Sea Organization. Sometimes very quickly, John, yeah. And the way we did our interventions also differed to that extent. We conducted the interventions always to a point where they always willingly, always calmly, in a kind way, never pushing, never threatening, nothing. We made, without locking a door or a window, barring inclement weather, of course, in which case we didn't lock doors, we just closed them. But the person always had the freedom to move around. I don't want to dwell on that point too much, though. But we kept the intervention going. This will all be in my book. I'm going into detail how we did interventions and recoveries. We did the intervention to the point where the individual took mum and dad, or mum or dad, into a kitchen or a side room and said, I can't go back to that crazy group, but I'm going to need help. You know, help in getting my belongings back, help in, do I need to keep the e-meter? Do I need to keep all these volumes of information? What do I need to do? So then we'd sit down with this long list of points. Do you have anything left at the org or not? Do you want help in going to get it because you're scared? It's okay. If you're scared, somebody will go with you. Mom, dad, who volunteers? You know, do you have an e-meter left there? Do you want to keep your e-meter or your books, or do you want to give them away? I don't know, I'm not sure. Great, put them away in the corner under your bed until you know what you want to do with them again. This is your life now. You have your own choices once again. If you don't know, take the time to think about it until you know what you want to do. Well, what about my religion? Do I have to go back to mum and dad's church? I said, well, you know, we're not really theologians of any, you know, so we're not going to get into religion, but what we want to tell you is, again, it's your choice. We had to keep giving, keep bringing the former Scientologist back to realizing that he was his own boss. His life was his own. He could say what he wanted and what he didn't want. He could go where he wanted or not go. And that was one of the key things that we covered in recovery. Another was, do I have to stay with mum and dad? Do I have to stay with my uncle? Well, do you have a job? Do you have an income coming in so you can care for yourself? No, it's going to take me a while. So what do you want to do about where you want to live and how you want to get an income going? So we'd step through these key points, and I've just covered a very, very few of them. Probably the biggest point in recovery was realizing that the tech was a load of bunk. And we usually did a recovery with the Scientologist for anywhere from 3 to 4 days. It lasted that long. Sometimes it was over in a day, but usually it lasted a few days. We had one little lassie we did in Pennsylvania. She was an OT7. She'd been in Scientology for 15 years. She knew everything about it. She loved it. And we spoke to her that first day and tried to make friends with her and build some rapport with her. And she was sort of looking at us with this evil eye all through the afternoon and evening, and wouldn't talk to us. Finally, she went to bed, her parents went to bed. Next morning, tap, tap, tap on my door where Jerry and I were. Went to the door. There is, let's call her Susan. There is Susan, tears streaming down her cheeks. She pulled me out of the room and I closed the door. She said, "I've got to talk to you. I've got to talk to you. Something is terribly wrong." We went down to her room and I saw her e-meter set up on the table like she'd been giving herself a solo session. And I said, "What is this? Tell me what's going on." She said, "I went for a walk like I always do, and I came back and I started to give myself my OT7 session, and I sat down and there was nothing there." And she was very, very concerned. She couldn't find a BT or a cluster of BTs or anything like that. It had all gone. I said, "How did this happen?" Because I'm going along with her still. I don't want to challenge her too much. This is just the start of the second day. She said, "Hana, I don't know, but I think it must have been talking with you yesterday and hearing you tell some stories about LRH and how you had to leave because you had all these headaches and all this kind of stuff. But it's not there anymore." So I said, "What are your opinions about this?" We didn't tell anybody anything. We got them to think it through. Well, she says, "I think they've never been there at all."
I had that feeling too.
I
Or
think
you'd scared them away. So you might be the quick OT7.
Ah, there you go, John. Yeah, so all I did was I sat and I looked at her. I didn't say anything. She said, "I knew it. The very fact you're not saying anything. Did I really mock these all up all these years?" I said, "If you want my opinion, I will say yes. But you may refrain, you may think otherwise." She says, oh no, I know I just created everything myself." Now, of course, they weren't all that easy. You know, there's another gal we worked with in Southern California who was very, very argumentative. I mean, she was the captain of her debate team in college, and she argued. It didn't matter if you told her one apple was like another apple. She'd argue that it wasn't, you know. So to take care of that nature of hers, we had her father and her two uncles, not her mother. She wasn't in good with her mother. We had them sit and compile 40 likes about Scientology, which was very hard to do, and 40 dislikes. Those were a cinch, easy. So we had to help them a little with their dislikes, and with their likes, I'm sorry. And then at the end of that part of the technique, we got them to take one like and team it up with an appropriate dislike. For example, I like the fact that the creed of the church says man has the freedom to speak freely. I'm paraphrasing. So, but what I don't like, Susan, is the fact that you don't call us more often. We can't get to you when we call. We have to go through the receptionist who can't find you, who puts us through to some other place. We can never get to you. Why is that? Well, blah, 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 blah. And out would come the argument. So right from the beginning on the first day, she threw Jerry out of the room. She threw an associate of ours out of the room, and I was left there for about 2 hours trying to gain a little bit of rapport with her. Finally, after lunch, she threw me out. So we had arranged it so that the father and the two uncles now held the reins of the intervention. They had their 40 lists of likes and dislikes paired up into questions or statements, and they were to just, every time Susan threw out some objection, they would say, well, I understand your point, but, you know, I like the fact that the creed of the Church of Scientology says all men have inalienable rights to this and this and this and this. So how come, you know, we don't have the right to speak with you now, if she was objecting to talking any further about Scientology? And this went on for 2 days. Susan would take off, she'd say, I'm not listening to this crap anymore. She'd take off, walk down this long hill down to the nearest town. Halfway down, in the California heat and humidity, she'd get tired, she'd sit down by the main road. The brother would run back up on the hill for some hats, suntan lotion, jugs of drinking water. The two brothers and the father would sit down, they'd carry on the drill. They'd just take the next point on their list and the next point. Once they got through their 40, they simply went back to the beginning again. Susan didn't notice. She was so stuck in the mindset, she didn't even notice that they had their lists out and were reading from them, and that they went back to the beginning several times to go through the same contradiction and the truth. This point in Scientology and the truth. So finally, after 2 days, on the morning of the third day, she said she wanted to speak with us. Something triggered overnight, and she realized she was not going to win the battle she was putting on. And from then it was all downhill. And she recovered very, very quickly. And I think it was because she had had those 2 days of looking at the contradictions in Scientology and the way they had been paired up to the truth. So each one of these was different. Some of the people we got out were so damaged. There was one lovely young girl who came from the compound at Hemet. She was in charge of all the artists who were drawing the drawings for Hubbard's books and for the tape covers on his tape albums and all sorts of things. And she was so damaged that we'd tell her one thing out of a Hubbard book or something and give her the comparative truth. And she'd go, oh my God, I would never have been able to see that on my own. 1 minute later, she couldn't remember it. She had no capacity to retain memory, to retain data at all. She'd burst out crying just every few minutes, every half an hour. She didn't even know why she was crying. She said the agony inside is so bad that it wants to choke me, and she'd keep on crying for another half hour. And we were fortunate in some cases to have become acquainted with Dr. Margaret Singer in Berkeley, very famous psychologist, world-renowned. And we called up Margaret on a number of these cases and said, Margaret, we've got this super gal here. She's just come out and she's pleading for help. And we're not psychologists. You know, we're not therapists. This is not something we can deal with. Could you speak to her? Absolutely, my dear. And we'd pass the phone over to the young woman, and she and Margaret would have a 3-hour talk right then. And then Margaret would set up a schedule once a week on a Saturday or a Sunday morning. This person would call her, and then the next person would call her. They'd chat for an hour, and then the next one would call her through the Saturday or the Sunday. So we tried to build up networks of people like those. You know, we had some in New Jersey, the Goldbergs. We had one person in Moscow who helped with interventions over there. We had somebody else the family referred us to in Holland when we did an intervention there. We tried to set up these mental health people who would step in and help us when that kind of situation came about. And when it did, I think because maybe we had built up a lot of rapport with the Scientologist by then, they did not question talking to a therapist or a psychologist or a counselor. We just rolled it straight over, and it went like a warm knife going through butter. But again, each is different. We have to handle them as we see them, as they happen in front of us. We're always careful not to hold anyone. The parents are alerted if you try to hold your son or daughter, or your wife, or your spouse. We will pick up everything we have here and we will walk out, because we are not about to do anything illegal, and certainly not end up on some sort of long-term prison sentence. And I'm sorry to say, but we're not doing it for your son or daughter. Please don't think badly of us. But no, we have our own lives to continue.
It's also tremendously damaging that when Ted Patrick brought in his notion of deprogramming, there are many people who would then have years of recovering from the experience of leaving the cult. Yes. And it's just, Yes. And even if somebody goes back in, the point is to offer them the choice. And if they choose to go back in, and I'm happy to say in the last 5 years I was counselling people, nobody did, but if they do choose to go back in, you've at least, I said about the chap with the placard, Christian and I saw him, the only member of his family he'd talked to in 7 years was his sister, and as a consequence of, I worked with the family for over, I think 3 months before we actually saw him. But as a consequence of that, he was back in touch with all of his family. So Scientology, which is, by the way, all about communication.
All about communication.
We've done rather better than that.
Right. One other thing, John, you touched on it right now. If the case we call them cases, of course. The person we were working with, if we came to a standstill, we had prepared the family for it. By the way, we did preparations of the family that lasted 2 to 3 days. And the longer we were doing interventions, the longer the preparations went, because Scientology had learned what we were doing. So they prepared the Scientologists for us even further, so we had to up our techniques all the time. But if we came to a deadlock with a Scientologist, the parents had been briefed to say, look, honey, we know that you're having a hard time with this. If you can agree to stay and listen to what Jerry and Hannah have to say to our satisfaction, we promise you can return to Scientology. Can we get an agreement on that? Of course, the parents wouldn't be satisfied until, but the Scientologist didn't know that. And always that worked well. The Scientologist agreed with it, and invariably, there were only 2 cases where they went back. But invariably they said, yeah, I'll do that for you, Mom and Dad. And in 2 to 3 days, we had turned the corner and everything was well.
I think I've mentioned Ted Patrick, and I see here that Nan has something to say about Ted Patrick.
Oh, you bet.
She's already written it down. She read my mind.
John, do you
pardon?
Back to you. Yeah, okay.
Sometime in the mid-'80s, Sandra Sachs, Ted Patrick's secretary, phoned me, indicating that Paulette Cooper had suggested she call me. Apparently, Ted was having trouble with the Scientology deprogramming, and it seemed as though he needed help from an ex-Scientologist. I explained to Sandra that my counseling activities required the counselee to be in agreement with the action. Sandra implied, did not state, that this was a voluntary counseling, and I agreed to help. When I arrived in Santiago, I was introduced to Paula Dane, and I immediately ascertained that such was not the case. Instead, it was a typical Ted Patrick deprogramming scene, already in the 12th unsuccessful day. I was assigned to sleep in the same bed with Paula, while the guard slept on a mattress in the open doorway on the floor. The patio door was locked from the inside and blocked from the outside. I felt like a prisoner. The next morning, Ted arrived. We assembled in the living room and the session began. Ted made some outlandish statement about Scientology that both Paula and I knew weren't true, and I challenged him in the presence of everyone. To Ted's credit, he didn't challenge me in front of anyone. He took me aside after the session was over and tore a strip off me. On the evening before I was leaving, I wrote a note to Paula asking, because we couldn't talk together. We played games all through this time. We weren't really making progress at all. But on the evening before I was leaving, I wrote a note to Paula, which I gave her on her way out of the bathroom, and I was on the way in, asking for her mother's phone number in LA. Her parents were divorced, and it was her father and stepmother that were conducting this deprogramming, and her natural mother and her stepfather were frantic. And so it was her stepmother's family that I was asking for the phone number for. And I called them on my stopover. I explained, they wanted me to stay, but I explained that I was here on Ted's dime and I could not in all conscience stay over. I promised to phone as soon as I arrived home, which I did, and found myself on a flight back to LA the next day. Against the wishes of my family and Paulette and everyone, I had to fight to go. Paula's parents arranged an appointment for me to speak with the police in San Diego, and they were very gentle with me, explaining that I could be charged along with Ted Patrick. I, of course, knew that before I even went. That's one of the reasons that my family didn't want me to go. Paulette didn't want me to go because she had recommended me. However, the law states that kidnapping is a criminal offense. Therefore, Ted Patrick because he deprograms people, is not exempt from the law, in my opinion.
Of course not.
The criminal code is what it is and cannot be manipulated so that the good guy that is committing a crime for a good cause is exempt from prosecution. This was and still is my rationale. I, of course, became suspect to the whole anti-cult field. And that was no easy time either. Sometime after I returned home, I learned that Paula had finally been released after a month and that the programming was unsuccessful. One day, out of the blue, Paula phoned me from Toronto asking to come to my home. And of course, that was absolutely impossible. However, I agreed to meet her in Toronto. She presented me with a Christmas present first, and then proceeded to tell me that she was suing the Church of Scientology, and she wanted me to testify. I indicated that I absolutely would not. During this period, I taped every phone call that came into my home. It was legal in Ontario at that time to tape without disclosure, as long as one of the conversing parties was in the conversation. The next thing that happened was Paula's lawyer, Donald C. Randolph, phoned me several times each day, trying to each day being a little heavier than the last one, so that I finally challenged him with threatening me that if I didn't testify for Paula, that I would be named in the suit as well. He assured me that was not the case. However, a short time later came the inevitable lawsuit. Said case went to trial, and I had to go to San Diego to testify. There was one juror lied about his ability to remain neutral when questioned, having a niece in a cult. The stupid people to accept him. With the result being a hung jury. This disturbed me greatly, and it almost made me give up. If the law couldn't see through these things, what good was I doing?
I must say that I came to a similar conclusion at the end of my own cases in England, that the realization that it was so easy to hoodwink judges if you had a very expensive lawyer. And it's a very disillusioning realization that you believe in the legal system and then you find, in fact, a judge 6 months after I lost a case, 6 months after I lost, the loophole that the cult had used was closed, and the judge who did this, Lord Chief Justice Wolfe, said the situation in English law is he with the deepest pockets wins.
That's disgusting.
Yeah, and I couldn't get it reversed because the...
Well, the ultimate point of that is that I turned around and sued Donald Randolph. Yep. And I received an out-of-court substantial settlement. What I want to tell you here that my purpose in disclosing this incident in the first place is to show how lawyers can also be conned by Scientologists into doing their bidding. Yep. Scientology paid for Paula Dane's lawsuit. Yep. And this brings me to another incident, which I was counseling a man by the name of Robert Griffith. And we worked together to produce a brief for the College of Physicians and Surgeons here in Ontario. The awareness of a need to create this brief was really strong, and Bob and I worked for months before we presented it. He was suffering from a life-threatening condition due to having taken the purification rundown. In those days, it was only the Purif. It wasn't the full-fledged Narconon program. So I still have the complete history and documents that I presented to the College of Physicians and Surgeons.
There's some people here who might be interested in that.
Okay, I have it. Our brief included a request for a review of the quasi-medical practices being recommended to patients by Scientology physicians and Scientology itself. Within 24 hours, we were rejected. My question is, why? Well, we all know why. Each of us has our own personal history to tell. I have presented a few of mine, and if we combined our stories, there's a picture equaling any horror story in the movies on TV series, except our stories are real. Real life living experiences, spanning the time from the 1960s to the present time. Nothing has changed. We need our legislators to provide a safe environment for us to live and bring up our children. The biggest hurdle we have to jump, in my humble opinion, is Scientology as a religion. Scientology hides behind this cloak of legislators, judges and jurors, police persons and government officials are all afraid to take action against a so-called religion. A committee formed to decide whether or not the organization before them is worthy of religious and or charitable status has to make this decision based on an established set of valid criteria, in my opinion. What fail-safe guides can be used to sift through the potential maze of lies which may be brought before them? Not maybe, will be brought before them, for sure. It is important to consider legislation limiting the automatic bestowing of tax-free status But we also need to provide those making the decisions with the tools that will enable them to make fair judgments. If a religion has a hidden arm that is guilty of committing crimes and hurts decent law-abiding citizens, shouldn't it be charged and punished regardless of its religious status?
Absolutely.
If a religion has a hidden arm that is guilty of committing crimes and hurts decent law-abiding citizens, should it have religious status? One of the methods that Scientology has of controlling the ruling body is called the Department of Government Affairs, which states in part, always find or manufacture enough threat against them to cause them to sue for peace. I'd like to share with you a personal experience I had as an example of what I've been talking about. While in Calgary, visiting friends who had just left Scientology, I went together with Mr. John Hooker to Edmonton to speak with the then Minister of Consumer Affairs for the province of Alberta. However, we were escorted into the office of a newly appointed Deputy Minister, Mr. John Layton's office instead. The purpose of our visit was to present information to the ministry and to see if we could label Scientology as a fraudulent organization. We talked for a while, and Mr. Logan turned to me and asked me, Layton, turned to me and asked me whether I knew anyone who doesn't have something to hide. I was stunned for a moment, as I wasn't expecting such a question from a minister. I demurely replied, I haven't. And Mr. Layton, rising up with his hands on his big mahogany desk, and in a forceful, angry voice, well, I have. In the name of justice, some officials might need to remove themselves from participating in key rulings of government. Either they have the strength to go beyond their own personal fears, or they haven't. And if they haven't, they must have the strength to recuse themselves.
I'll actually add one little point to that. I was talking to a journalist who was reporting on the Lisa McPherson case, who asked an old friend of hers who happened to be the district attorney, who was meant to be dealing with the case, why he had dropped the case. And he said, I don't want anybody counting the number of scotch bottles in my trash. So there you go. We'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you.